Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Hugh McKay. I'm president of the board of directors of the City Club. Today's speaker, Valerie B. Jarrett, is a senior advisor to President Barack Obama. And in her role, she oversees the offices of public engagement, intergovernmental affairs, Olympic, Paralympic, and youth sports, and the White House Office of Urban Affairs. She chairs the White House Council on Women and Girls and leads the White House's business outreach efforts. Prior to joining the Obama administration, Ms. Jarrett was the chief executive officer of the Habitat Company. She also served as co-chair of the Obama-Biden presidential transition team and was senior advisor to Mr. Obama's presidential campaign. Ms. Jarrett has held various other positions in both the public and private sector, including as chairman of the Chicago Transit Board, the Commissioner of Planning and Development for the City of Chicago, and Deputy Chief of Staff for Mayor Richard M. Daley. She also had a successful private law practice. Ms. Jarrett also served as chairman of the board of the Chicago Stock Exchange, director of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and chairman of the University of Chicago Medical Center Board of Trustees, and she has served on various other important boards. Ms. Jarrett received her BA from Stanford University in 1978 and her JD from the University of Michigan Law School. Ms. Jarrett has been an outspoken leader in the Obama administration on youth issues and school safety. She organized the landmark White House Conference on Bullying Prevention, which brought together students, teachers, advocates, the private sector, policymakers, including the President and First Lady, to take on an important but previously overlooked problem that is obviously very timely here today. In her business outreach efforts, Ms. Jarrett has effectively focused on initiatives to draw upon successful people to, as she says, reach back to hold out a helping hand to those coming up after them. Ms. Jarrett has been widely commended for her vision, her energy, and her willingness to address tough problems. Please welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, Valerie Jarrett.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Thank you, Hugh, for that very generous introduction. I also want to recognize Jim Foster, the director of the club. And before I begin, I just have to give a huge shout out to Gabriel Jones. What you have done with your essay in the theme of Stop the Hate, that's why we're going to end bullying in the schools, is because of people with your candor, your honesty, your grace, and your strength. So a round of applause for Gabriel. It is indeed an honor for me to be here, celebrating your 100th year. My goodness, happy birthday. That's a big one. I'm delighted to be a part of it. It's a terrific forum for civic engagement, and I want to commend you for the robustness of your program. I understand each and every week you have speakers, and that is tremendous. It brings your community together, and that's essential for a strong city. It's a place for citizens who believe that each of us has a role to play, individually and collectively, in strengthening the country that we all love. It's a fundamental belief that we are greater working together. And that has seen us through many pivotal points in our nation's history. And I believe that we're right now at another pivotal moment. It's a make or break moment for the middle class and for all of those who are working to be in the middle class. And the stakes are extremely high, but I believe the opportunities are also very great. Just over 3 years ago, faced with the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, President Obama stepped up and took bold action. And while we have a lot of work ahead of us, everyone would agree, our goal is to not just get back to where we were, but rather to create an economy that's built to last. Before I address the road ahead, I'd like to tell you a story about what motivates me each day. It's a story about a man whose name I do not know, but who I think about each and every day. During the last presidential campaign, which was a long one, as we traveled all across the country, we were in Texas. We spent a lot of time in Texas. And we'd been there for 3 days, and one day, on our last day, we got into the elevator, and there was an elderly black man who had been the elevator operator each of our days there, taking us up and down. And he said to then Senator Obama, I'd like to give you something. Well, I have to give you a little context. It was 7:30 in the morning. The then senator had a cold. He's not actually a morning person, and was feeling a little grumpy. And so when the gentleman said, I'd like to say something to you, I thought, oh dear, is this really the best time? But he cleared his throat, and he said, sir, I'd like to give you something. And so, of course, being nosy, we all leaned in to see what it was. And it was his military patch. And he said, Senator Obama, I'd like to give this to you. Well, the senator, realizing what it was, said, oh my goodness, I couldn't possibly accept your military patch. Well, they went back and forth. I insist. No, I couldn't possibly. Back and forth. Finally, the gentleman cleared his throat. And I thought, oh no, what are you going to say? And he said, sir, I've carried this patch with me every day for 40 years. It gave me the strength to serve in the military and the tenacity to have a very humble job. And it has given me the courage I needed to get through some dark days. And you have a tough road ahead. Little did he know. And I want to give you something that has given me strength. Well, of course, I burst into tears. We joked that some of the Secret Service agents had tears in their eyes as well. And so later I said to the president, what did you do with that patch? And he said, I put it in my pocket. I said, well, typical guy. I didn't mean where did you put it? I meant what did you do with it? How did you feel about the emotion of somebody giving you something like that? Well, he got me back. He said, Valerie, I meant I put it in my pocket. So he proceeded to reach in his pocket, and he pulled out that patch, and he pulled out about 10 other trinkets that people had given him along the way. And he proceeded to tell me the story about each one of those trinkets, who had given it to him, what the circumstances were, why of all of the gifts he received, it was special enough to put it in his pocket. Well, I think of that gentleman every single day when I go through the gates of the White House. And I look to my right, and the Washington Monument blinks red lights, and I get in the dark. And so I see those lights, and I wait for them to blink 3 times. And I think about his quiet dignity, his dedication to hard work, his service to our country, and all of the sacrifices that required, and his unselfish act of giving the then senator, who was on an unlikely journey, one of his most treasured possessions, because he believed in a better tomorrow. He reminded me of so many other hardworking Americans who I've had the privilege to meet as I've traveled around our great country. These men and women do not want government to solve all their problems. They certainly are not looking for a handout. All they want is an America where hard work pays off and working responsibly is rewarded, and where everyone competes on a level playing field and plays by the same set of the rules, where you can get a good education, you can find a job, you can buy a home, you can afford to send your children to college so that they will fare just a little better than you, and then you can retire with dignity. That's the kind of America that lives up to the basic promise that no matter who you are or where you come from, you can make it if you try. And every single day, I believe that President Obama and his administration are fighting to keep that promise. I believe that President Obama's personal leadership qualities, ones that I have grown to appreciate over the 2 decades since our friendship began, have helped him in that effort. His character, his integrity, steadfast determination, his resilience, his moral compass that points towards true north, his compassion for others, and his willingness to ignore the short-term political wins and instead to focus like a razor on our long-term goals. His courage to make extremely tough decisions under difficult circumstances when literally lives are at stake, and his ability to laugh at himself and take a joke or two, and on occasion, carry a tune. Of course, President Obama understands that the scope and the size of our challenges facing America today are great. But most importantly, he understands that for far too many Americans, our country's basic promise has eroded for far too long. Here in Cleveland, you know that long before the economic crisis of 2008, wages were flat while the cost of everything was going up. Companies were downsizing here and they were moving jobs overseas. Our government was borrowing money to pay for 2 wars, a big tax cut that mostly benefited the very wealthy, but we weren't making crucial investments in education and infrastructure and clean energy, investments that strengthen our economy for the long term and would keep us globally competitive. And while we were hit with the worst economic crisis, then things went from bad to worse, much worse. When President Obama took office, our economy had already lost 4 million jobs in just the last 6 months of the prior administration. Well, today, we still have a very long way to go, and we want to make sure that everyone who wants a job can find one. This morning, we learned that private employers added an additional 130,000 jobs last month, bringing our unemployment rate down to 8.1%. So that makes 26 consecutive months of private sector job growth. But we still have a long way to go. Manufacturers are hiring for the first time since the 1990s, many of them even bringing jobs back from overseas because they found that the United States was actually the better place to do business. And here in the Midwest, in the heartland of our country, pretty close to my hometown of Chicago, the American auto industry is back on top, with General Motors now #1 in the world, and Chrysler and Ford both hiring again. And even as we have seen several encouraging signs over the last few months, the President also signed the Dodd-Frank bill that puts in place rules of the road to ensure that taxpayers never again have to come to the rescue of banks who take excessive risk. He also put in place the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. For the first time, we have an agency in the federal government whose sole job is to look out for you, the consumer. Now, we have a lot of work left to do. There's no question about that. But today, a little more than 3 years after the President took office, we're beginning to see what change actually looks like. Change is the decision the President made to stop waiting for Congress to act and increase the fuel efficiency standards on new cars and trucks so that by the middle of the next decade, you can drive an American-made car that gets 55 miles to the gallon and save a typical family $8,000. Change is the investments that the President made in clean energy technology and improving our standards for existing energy, all of which reduce our dependence on foreign oil and are good for our environment. Change is health care reform that already prohibits insurance companies from denying coverage to your children if they have a pre-existing condition. Or the 2.5 million young people who now are able to go on their parents' insurance, including my own 26-year-old who a year ago came on my insurance for a few months. Change is the senior citizens who so far have saved $3.4 billion or an average of $600 apiece in prescription drugs just since the law passed. Change is a health system that requires insurance companies to provide preventive services such as mammograms and prostate screening and screening for high blood pressure and heart disease and, yes, contraception, because too many people avoid going in for their preventive services because they can't afford the copays. So now insurance companies have to do that without a copay. And, of course, that's not all. Change is the steps the President has taken to make college more affordable. He's cut out the middleman in the student loan program, which now gives money directly to young people. He's increased Pell Grants and funding to HBCUs around the country. He's lowered the maximum percentage of student loan recipients' annual income that banks are allowed to charge them as payments for their debt. And just last week, the President traveled around the country to college campuses to call on Congress to act so that the student loan rates don't double in July. And today, the President is in Arlington, Virginia, speaking to high school juniors and seniors about his plans to make college more affordable for them. Change is keeping the promise that the President made in 2008 to bring the Iraq War to a responsible end. And as I traveled home over the holiday season, it was so heartening to see our men and women in uniform, knowing that many of them were returning from their very last tour of duty. And as he announced this week, in Afghanistan, he is moving forward with an agreement to end the war in Afghanistan and begin a new partnership with Afghanistan. And I want to take a moment to thank any of the veterans and their families who may be with us in the audience today. Our country is forever grateful for your service and your sacrifice. And the President is absolutely committed to make sure we take care of you as well as you all took care of us. The absolute amazing selflessness and teamwork of our men and women in uniform is a big part of what motivates the President each and every day. By the ordinary Americans he hears, from letters he receives, and from traveling around the country, but also from his own life experiences. Many of you have heard the story of the President, but I provided to you to give you some context back to those leadership qualities. His mom, a single mother, raised him pretty much on her own until she had to pursue her career, and then his grandparents helped raise him. So many families in our country now depend on that extended circle to raise their children. His father abandoned him at a young age, so he knows what it's like to grow up with a dad, which made him all the more determined to be a good father to Malia and Sasha. He watched his grandmother go to work every day in a bank where she was smart as a whip and could have been the bank president, trained people in her department, and of course they leapfrogged the men, leapfrogged over her for promotion after promotion, and so he saw her disappointment. He watched his great-uncle and his grandfather both serve our country in the military and take advantage of the GI Bill and see how both the challenges and opportunities they faced when they came home affected their lives. Of course, he married this extraordinary young lawyer who in her own right was very accomplished, but he watched Michelle struggle to make the balance between family and home work when their girls were so young. So it should be no accident that the very first bill that he signed when he came into office was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which helps protect women and provide their equal pay and give them a little more ammunition to make sure there's a level playing field in the compensation arena. And it should be no surprise that the first two women that he appointed to the Supreme Court would be, first two people he appointed to the Supreme Court would be women, including our first Latina on the Supreme Court. And it should be no surprise that within the first few months of being in office, he created the White House Council on Women and Girls, which I'm so proud to chair, that's dedicated to making sure that every agency in the federal government does everything possible to make sure that our programs, our initiatives, the legislation we support are designed to improve the quality of life for women and girls in our country and abroad. President Obama's mom raised him with a core decency and a belief in the common creed that I am my brother's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. She tragically died in her early 50s, not long after the president married. She was not able to know her grandchildren or see her son grow to be president of the United States. And the president's youngest daughter was also gravely ill as a baby, so he understands firsthand the importance of quality health care. Hoping that his girls will grow up in a world where they can achieve their dreams and compete on an even playing field, that's why he's fighting to make sure that we all have access to opportunity, beginning with a world-class education. The president believes that we should all treat each other with respect and tolerance and decency, which is why he pushed for the hate crimes legislation named after Matthew Shepard. It's also why he pushed to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, so everyone can serve in our military regardless of who you love. And it's why he is supporting two bills, Gabrielle, for you, pending before Congress that would help stop bullying in our schools so that no parent has to suffer the pain of a child being sad or committing suicide because she has or he have been tormented in school. And it's why he strongly supports the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. And I'm pleased to note that just last week, the Senate voted by 68 to 31, bipartisan bill. That's something to be celebrated. Of course, I have to tell you, when one in three women during their lifetime will be raped, stalked, or victims of violence by an intimate partner, and every 3 days a woman dies of domestic violence, I would have thought that bill would have been unanimous. And we continue to hope that the Senate bill will be passed by the House, because women and men around our country need that law. Now, none of the change the last 3 years has been easy, but when is change ever easy? Change is always hard, particularly big changes. And in President Obama's case, change has been made even harder by an unprecedented level of gridlock in Washington. The president came into the White House with a track record of bringing people together. I remember back when the president started out in the Illinois Senate. He was the key person that party leaders would call on to work with Republicans on tough issues. His leadership would send him off to work with the Republicans when it seemed as though they were miles apart. And he would find the art of the possible, the common ground, and reach compromises that both sides would not only support, but willingly support. And I know the president was eager to find the same common ground with the colleagues on both parties when he came to Washington, on issues like job creation and infrastructure, immigration reform, health reform, and many issues that have traditionally received bipartisan support. And outside of Washington, I believe that the vast majority of American people still share this hope. On Inauguration Day, people came to the National Mall from all across our country, all ages, all colors, all incomes, many with very different views from one another, but they all shared a common view that our fortunes would rise and fall as one. And they were inspired by a common hope of a brighter tomorrow. Yet, there are those who said that their main goal was to make sure to defeat President Obama, regardless whether or not the consequences had an adverse impact on American families. Now, some of you can probably tell I get a little frustrated by all of this, and I think you probably do as well. And I bring it up today because it is an important, if disappointing, part of the last few years, and it must change. I'm proud to say, with confidence, that despite the Washington culture that all too often puts the next election ahead of the next generation, President Obama is not about to give up fighting for you. Time and time again, when the theater of the day dominates the press, the president calls his team together in the Oval Office, and I'm pulling out my hair, and he says, don't get distracted. Don't lose your focus. Remember why we're here. So he will continue that fight. He's laid out in his last State of the Union a blueprint for America, where everyone gets a fair shot, everyone does their fair share, and everyone plays by the same set of rules. Because tackling the challenges we face shouldn't be about ideology or party. It's about common sense. It's about making college affordable for all young Americans so that our young people can harness that entrepreneurial spirit and be the innovators of tomorrow. And improving our college system by working with the private sector and creating a curriculum in our community colleges, for example, that trains people for jobs that are available in the marketplace, not jobs that no longer exist. It's about asking those who can afford to pay their fair share to do so that we can afford the investments in our roads and bridges and schools and technology and science and caring for our veterans. It's about helping companies bring more jobs back from overseas and making sure that industries of the future take root and thrive in cities such as Cleveland and all across our country. And it's about responsibly bringing down our federal deficit and not balancing our budget on the backs of senior citizens or disabled or the poor. Those aren't Republican goals or Democratic goals. They're American goals. And we're going to continue to work with everyone who wants to see our country reach those goals. And that brings me back to the gentleman I mentioned early on in the elevator. I haven't seen him since that day 4 years ago, and I may never see him again. But I can imagine some of the ways that I hope his life has improved. In many ways, the president he helped elect has already made a huge difference in his life. If he's like most people his age, his savings on prescription drugs have made a difference. He's paying less in taxes. It'll be easier for his grandchildren to afford to go to college and pay back their student loans. And he may very well have friends or family members who've come home from the military, from the war. And at the same time, there are still so many responsibilities that we must fulfill. And I imagine that that gentleman's community is recovering, but it hasn't yet fully recovered from the worst recession. I imagine that he's still wondering what kind of a world he's going to leave behind for his children and his grandchildren. And although he served our country so proudly and has worked hard, I imagine that he's worried about whether he will be able to retire with a little money in his pocket. So I'm going to continue to think about him each morning as I pass through those gates. And I'll think about all the other Americans who are just like him, working hard and counting on our government to work with them and for them, to help level the playing field, to give them a fair chance. I know that many of you are working towards those goals right here. And as I have traveled around the country, I have met so many ordinary Americans doing extraordinary things and saying extraordinary things because they care so much about this country they love. So I want to thank those of you who are here for meeting your individual and collective responsibilities for your families, your businesses, your communities, and your country. And as you do, please know that the President will be right there working alongside of you every step of the way. Thank you very much.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're listening to a forum featuring Valerie Jarrett, Senior Advisor to President Barack Obama. We will return to Ms. Jarrett in a moment for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We encourage you all to formulate your questions now, and please do keep them brief. We welcome all of you here and those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS IdeaStream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Today is the City Club's annual Stephen A. Minter Endowed Forum honoring the life and career of Stephen Minter by the members' banks of the Cleveland Foundation. We are joined today at the head table by Stephen Minter and his wife Dolly. Will you both please stand and be recognized? And daughter Robin as well. We're pleased to welcome guests at tables hosted by Baker Hostetler, Buckley King, Case Western Reserve University, Cleveland State University, Friends of Joe Simperman, Kent State University, and Key Bank. Thank you for joining us today. Now we'd like to return to Ms. Jarrett for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from any of you. Holding the microphones today are 100th Anniversary Assistant Director Betsy Wallace and City Club Program Director Carrie Miller. First question, please.
Ms. Jarrett, my name is Colleen Cotter. I'm the Executive Director of the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland, and I had the honor of serving on the program with you and the President at the recent White House Forum on the state of civil legal services in the United States. Could you make a few comments about the administration's position on the value of civil legal services?
Absolutely. And as the President said to you that day, and I echoed, the role that the Legal Assistance Foundation plays is so vital for the health and security of our country, and so many people who cannot access the legal system but for the services you provide. So we commended you. The reason why we asked for you to come to the White House was so we could lift up the role that you play, the vital role that you play in representing so many people who would go without representation. And so I'm glad you mentioned it. It was a fun day in the White House. We looked around the room. We saw so many people dedicated to this important responsibility from all over the country. It's a part of the fabric of what makes our country so great is that people will take time to devote to representing those who would go without representation. So thank you, and that's a good way of getting a nice shout out for Legal Assistance Foundation.
Ms. Jarrett.
Thank you.
4 years ago, we were at the cusp of a major disaster in the economic sense, and everybody got united behind President Obama, or virtually everybody, and got him elected and saved us from going over the cliff. But since then, it seems to have dissipated so strongly that we have become such a divisive society. How do you explain that?
Well, simply, we have been through an extraordinary crisis. People's lives have been turned upside down. People who hadn't had job security for a very long time are even further behind. And this disaster in the economy touched almost every household around our country. And we're not used to that. We'd had some really good years under our belt, many of us. And so it's been a tumultuous time. And if you look at our nation's history, any time we've been through a tumultuous time, it is normal for people to be frustrated and concerned and wondering, what does the future hold? And I think that part of what the President has and will be talking about is his vision for the future. Because the other thing about our history is that we are resilient, we are tough, we are tenacious, and out of these troubled times inevitably comes creativity and entrepreneurship, and the role of government is to foster that and so that it can be unleashed, because that's what has to happen if we're going to be globally competitive. We're no longer competing state to state. When I worked in city government in Chicago, Illinois would be competing against Michigan or Ohio to try to get companies to relocate. In fact, one company relocated from Chicago to Ohio. I wasn't too happy about that. When I was in the city, that's not the competition anymore. The competition, and the governors from around the country and the mayors will tell you, you're competing with all over the world, because companies have great choices now. They can locate anywhere. And that's why it was so heartening when we had a forum at the White House where we invited a whole range of companies, small, medium, and large, who had shipped jobs overseas and then decided within varying periods of time that actually it was better to be here in the United States, and they're now bringing those jobs back. And so a long answer, or a short conclusion to your question, is that it's going to take time to heal. And I think expectations generally right now are quick fix. We are in a time where everything is moving so quickly, and the delayed gratification that our parents and grandparents understood, this generation has a harder time with. And so we have to manage expectations, and there is no quick silver bullet that's going to fix the economy. We're going to just have to work hard every single day to bring it back. But after 26 months moving in the right direction, that's no accident. That's a great deal of progress. But we still have a long way to go, and there's still too many families who are struggling. And so I think that's why you see that some of that initial enthusiasm before we fully appreciated, and when I say we, I mean everybody from all spectrums appreciated the magnitude of that deep, deep recession. Once it sunk in, of course it was painful. Of course it was frustrating for so many families.
Ms. Jarrett, thank you very much for being here with us in Cleveland today. I'd like to ask you to comment on a column that appeared in the New York Times a few days ago. This is projecting ahead to the presidential debates, where the columnist suggested that it would be wonderful if Michael Bloomberg would be an independent candidate, because he would, as a part of the debate, help to avoid platitudinous and broad generalities from the candidates. Would you please comment on that?
Well, I'm here actually wearing my official hat and not a campaign hat, where I could talk to you in the individual capacity, and there actually are laws that restrict what I can say. But what I can say to you is this, is that I think in the course of the next several months, what you are going to see from President Obama is a great degree of specificity about his track record, which has been robust, as well as specific things that he intends to do should he be so fortunate to be elected for a second term. He is looking forward to being extremely specific, and it's not going to take a third-party candidate to encourage him to do that. He's prepared to do that on his own because he thinks that's what the American people deserve.
How you doing, Ms. Jarrett?
Hello.
My question is this here. There's, you talked about when the president was in the Illinois Senate that he was trying to find common ground.
Yes.
Now, what are some of the goals going into a second term as far as creating common ground while bringing Wall Street and Main Street together as far as moving the gridlock in Washington along?
Well, for example, a few weeks ago, we were able to find common ground when we passed a jobs bill that helps small businesses go to scale more easily. There was a lot of red tape and restrictions that hurt small businesses from being able to grow, from being able to go public. And we worked together on a bipartisan basis to pass a bill that makes it a little easier for them, because we all know that small businesses are the economic engine of our country. That's where the growth is. That's where the entrepreneurship is. So we were able to come together on that. We need to continue to do that for our economy. Infrastructure, something that has traditionally received bipartisan support. The president proposed an infrastructure bank where you would take federal dollars, leverage them with private sector dollars so that the federal dollars would go further, and you would be able to invest in roads and bridges and public transit and waterways and everything that we need to support that infrastructure. That is what allows commerce to grow in our country. Immigration reform. In the last administration, both the president, President Bush, and 11 Republican senators co-sponsored comprehensive immigration reform. Well, what happened to that? We still need it. We're a law of immigrants, and we're a nation of laws, and we need to be able to come together and tackle that problem. And we have a history of being able to do it. Clean energy. The president has invested lots of dollars in clean energy, but we also need to make sure that we are supporting our existing industry. We've had more drilling in the president's time in office than we have in a decade, and so we need to continue to make sure that we're drilling and drilling safely so that we are reducing our dependence on foreign oil. Education. There isn't a business person that I speak to that doesn't say how important it is that our workforce is prepared when they come to work for the jobs of the future. And so continuing to work with the private sector to make sure that our curriculum, both in our community colleges, our universities, beginning in elementary school, is geared towards that. So many young people, including girls in particular, shy away from science and math and technology and engineering. Those are the jobs of the future. That's an agenda that should be bipartisan. Keeping our country safe. An agenda that should be bipartisan. There's plenty of opportunity for us to work together across the aisle if we really focus on trying to move our country forward. That's the message that you've heard from the president and will continue to hear for as long as he's in office. And our hope is it is one that the American people will encourage their elected representatives to hear.
Ms. Jarrett.
Hi.
As I met you briefly, I'm Councilman Jeff Johnson. My colleague Joe Simperman is here. We appreciate the Obama administration partnership with urban governments. And I know you worked with former Mayor Washington and Mayor Daley. What's your thoughts about how we can do more for the urban governments given the significant changes that has happened with local governments?
It's a very good question. A big part of why the Recovery Act that was passed a couple months after the president took office took the form that it did was to help support state and local governments, because we knew what was going to happen. We could see with the economy in crisis, it was inevitable that the revenues that would go to the state and local governments would reduce. And so in that Recovery Act, there were dollars for school teachers and firemen and policemen, first responders, as well as reducing taxes for 95% of working Americans, and also helping tax credits for business to invest in new forms of energy, for example. And so it was crafted that way specifically because we could see what was coming. Now that the Recovery Act is winding down, what you're seeing across the country is states and local governments struggling to make ends meet, which is why it's so important to get that private sector lift going back up again. I think partly because the president was a community organizer on the south side of Chicago and he worked so closely with local government. Certainly my experience as the Commissioner of Planning and Development gave us experience to appreciate how frustrating it is at the local level to not have a federal government that is there working with you. In fact, I used to always say when I worked for local government in Chicago that the last place I would ever work would be the federal government. So you shouldn't say things like that. But I'll tell you, the reason why I was drawn to leave my company and pick up and move to D.C. is because I knew the president understood cities and how vital they are. They are our economic engine, just as small businesses are to the private sector, cities are to our country. And so we are fortunate to have a cabinet that gets it as well. So take an Arnie Duncan, the Secretary of Education. He ran the Chicago Public Schools, so he knows what it's like to have worked at the local level. Or Sean Donovan, who ran the Housing Authority for New York. Now he's in charge of HUD. Kathleen Sebelius was a governor, knows exactly what it's like to be Chief Executive Officer of Kansas, a great Midwestern state. So just to name three, come together on a regular basis with us and individually on their own to figure out how can the federal government work together. Cleveland was selected for one of our programs where we're really targeting investment along a bunch of different agencies, because you shouldn't have to tailor your needs to meet these federal programs. The federal programs should tailor to meet your needs, and that's what I think this administration brings to the table. So we're encouraged by everything that you're doing here in Cleveland. It should be a national model, and you also have the advantage of having a very strong business and civic center that comes together in forums such as this, and that's how solutions are made. And what the federal government should do mostly is just help you as you say you need help and get out of your way.
Ms. Jarrett, I'd like to talk a little bit about health care reform. Last night, there was a pre-screening of a documentary here entitled The Health of the Nation. And as you might expect, the statistics that were cited were really appalling as it relates to the ill health of the nation. Yes. So if the Supreme Court should happen to overturn the mandated requirement for enrollment, can the legislation still move forward? Does it decimate the legislation, or can it still move forward in some other financial format so that reform continues?
First of all, we think that the Supreme Court is going to rule in our favor. And I think the last few weeks was a very good civics lesson. But for the lawyers in the audience who've actually appeared before the Supreme Court, you know that you can't glean a lot about how they're going to ultimately rule by what happens during the oral arguments. So we are extraordinarily confident that it is constitutional and will withstand scrutiny from the courts. If they decide that any one or various parts of it don't comply, well, then we're going to go back to the drawing board on those parts and see how we'll make it work together. So the benefits that are currently in place, so children with pre-existing conditions, preventive care, the closing of the donut hole, those we think that we can continue to afford no matter what ultimately happens, and then we'll have to see where it goes. And as the President joked at the Correspondents' Dinner, perhaps he'll just have to go back and pass it again. But we're hoping it doesn't come to that. We're hoping that we will prevail. But I can assure you that there are a lot of very smart people who are looking at a range of options so that we're prepared. There is so much to be gained from the Affordable Care Act. And one of our early visits, I will digress to say, was to the Cleveland Clinic. And looking, I remember visiting with the President, and the way they compensate their physicians is based on outcomes. There's so much that we can do to improve the overall care of our citizens. The preventive care component of it should have a dramatic impact on health care. As was mentioned in my introduction, I chaired the board of the University of Chicago Medical Center. Our emergency room was inundated with people who had acute conditions that, had they been treated timely, would never have forced them to go to an emergency room. Well, who pays for that emergency room? The charity care that is provided by the university or the Medicaid that is accepted, all of that comes from the public sector. And so, in a sense, we're paying for it anyway. Let's make sure that people have healthier outcomes. Our investment in health IT will transform the way patients are served. You can travel all over the country, and pretty soon you'll be able to have your medical records transferable over the internet, so you can get a second opinion without having to have tests run all over again. A lot of that thinking came from our visit to the Cleveland Clinic. Outcome-oriented, that is solely focused on the patient, making it affordable, incentivizing physicians and all healthcare providers to what can we do to bring down costs and provide quality care to the patient. That's what should guide all of our decisions, and that's what the Affordable Care Act does.
Ms. Jarrett, character matters in the President, this we know. And you have a 20-year relationship with our current President, and it is reputed to be a very close one. I can easily see how it could be one of mutual respect and affection. character is appropriately, intensely examined these days. But you have such a good perspective on the President's character that I would ask you to provide to us some insight into him as a friend and as someone to work with that we wouldn't get, that we haven't gotten so far.
That's an easy question. But can I answer it? That's just between us. You want to know what's like the real Barack Obama like? Is that what? Fortunately, he is. What you see is what you get. But I will tell you. I'll tell you a story that he repeated in a small form, and so with his permission, I would repeat it here. That is insightful, I think, and it's in part it's how he makes decisions. And someone asked him a question about Iran. And he said, what are you going to do about Iran? And it was a kind of this, it was about a couple of months ago, and so there was a lot of fever around taking military action. And he said, in a completely non-defensive voice, he said, let me tell you a story. He said, I was at one of our military hospitals not long ago, and I was going from room to room, as I do periodically, without any press, no attention, and I just want to visit people who've made these huge sacrifices for our country. And he went into a room, and there was a mom and her son, and the mom greeted him and was talking about her son who had been just tragically wounded. His brain was severely damaged, and he'll never be whole again. Young man. And so the president was talking to the mom, and she said, I want to show you a picture. And so she shows him a photograph, and in the photograph is this nice, tall young man in a uniform standing next to President Obama. And the photograph was taken when we visited Normandy a couple of years ago, right before her son was deployed. And the president said, before you make a decision about whether or not to go to war, you need to look into the faces of the people whose lives you are directly impacting. And it's why he went to West Point to announce his decision to increase the level of troops that he was sending to Afghanistan. I went with him on that trip, and sitting in that audience and seeing these young men and women who were looking at their commander-in-chief and sitting on the edge of their chair was amazing. But what I was looking at was my friend looking at them, knowing that the decision he was making was putting them in harm's way. And he had the courage to face them. He'd just been to Dover a few days earlier, seeing people come back for their final tour of duty. You have to be prepared to face up to the impact of your decisions on each individual human being. And what often happens at the federal government, the numbers are so big, you're in Washington, it's a different world out there. And the part of him that I have so much respect for in a decision-making process is that he doesn't make them in a vacuum. He listens most closely to those with whom he disagrees, and he looks right into the eyes of the people whose decisions he is making affect. That's one example. I could give you many more.
Given all the good that the President has done, and you listed that in your speech, I would like your own personal opinion regarding the effort to make sure he is not reelected again, and also to downplay the achievements that he's made in the 4 years that he has been in office. I don't want you to tell me what you think he feels, but what do you feel about this effort in the United States to downplay everything that he does and to get him out of office as soon as possible?
Well, again, I can't speak on behalf of the campaign, but I can give you my perspective, which is that it just makes us tougher. And it is frustrating, but as I said in my remarks, he will not allow that frustration to be a distraction. It's just, he just says, we just have to keep trying harder. And we also have to do something that we didn't do as much of in the first year, for example, as we have been doing lately, and that is we have to get out of Washington and tell our story. And yes, there's always going to be somebody else who's saying something. You know, that's life. That's the nature of life. That's the nature of a democracy where there's free speech, which we value. I mean, we should live in a democracy and take advantage of the fact that everybody can say what they think. And I think our perspective is if the president can get out and tell his story, and I believe this, I have confidence in the American people that they will ultimately vote their self-interest. And what he stands for and his vision for America and where he has taken us over this last 3 years, as tough as it has been, I strongly believe that that is what's in the best interest of the American people. And ultimately, that's what will prevail.
Good afternoon, Ms. Jarrett, and thank you very much for joining us. My name is William Tartar, and I'm the president of the Cleveland Young Professional Senate.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's great.
We are nonpartisan civic engagement organizations for YPs here in Cleveland. I'd like to thank you for your emphasis on young Americans through your Office of Public Engagement.
Thank you.
One of the things that we've been able to do here locally is to work with public officials on how to increase YP representation in public policy and decision-making through civic engagement and dialogue. My question to you is, how do we ensure that citizens, in particular young people, go from public engagement and involvement to actual policy decision-making and making those thoughts and ideas actually happen?
That's a really good question. Come and work in the Obama administration. It is true. I mean, I think so many young people, I'll use myself as an example. When I finished law school, I was the first person in my family to become a lawyer. And so my parents were really very proud of me. And so I did what everybody else was doing. I went to a big law firm. And after 6 years, I realized I was quite miserable at that big law firm. But I was afraid to take a different path because everybody had told me that that's what I should be doing. And I was chasing something that is right for a lot of people, but it was not right for me. And the fact that you're already involved in a leadership position shows that you are thinking beyond just, how much money am I going to make, but how much am I going to be able to give back. And so I encourage all young people at some point, and the earlier the better, to try some time in government. And it can be in the local government, it can be in the state or the federal government, but it is such a good experience to see what the shoe is like on the other foot. My experience at local government in Chicago has shaped me dramatically. My experience in the private sector, running a company and sitting on boards, has also shaped me. And so I say that if you really want to be a whole person, try a little bit of both. Some people go into government, they stay their entire career. I've gone in, gone out, gone in, gone out. But experience it, even if it's part-time. Every city, there are opportunities for you to serve on, whether it's a housing authority board or something where you can get that experience if you're not willing to do it full-time. Try it. But the only way to really be in the game is to get in the game.
Ms. Jarrett, welcome to Cleveland.
Thank you.
My entire lifetime, I can never remember health care costs, premiums going down. When is that going to take effect? And the second part of the question, there's an estimate between 30 and 50 million people will receive health care benefits under the Act. How many jobs is that going to create? Has an estimate been done?
Well, the job creation, the sky is really the limit, and we're already seeing it. If you look at the industry, I'm going to answer your questions in reverse order. If you look at the industries that have been really experiencing growth in the last few years, healthcare is growing dramatically. And it's a safe profession to go into because we're only going to need more and more of it. And our hope is that as you get more people into the healthcare exchanges, the costs will come down. But we also have to do things to make it easier. So the preventive care is designed to bring costs down. It got a lot of controversy for reasons I can't begin to explain, but providing women with contraception brings healthcare costs down. And so we have a wide range of dials that we can turn both in the private marketplace, in the insurance marketplace, also at the federal government. The biggest cost and the biggest problem with our deficit is healthcare costs. We have to bring down our costs and find all of the inefficiencies in the system and make it as efficient as possible. And so healthcare is a job creator. It will ultimately bend the cost curve. That's what it was designed to do. But again, this is a huge, huge initiative that doesn't just, you can't wave a magic wand and have it happen overnight. If you look at all our other major pieces of legislation, from Social Security to Medicare, it takes a while for it to actually materialize the benefits. But now And it's so interesting. There was a survey done a few years ago in connection with health reform, and it was a group of senior citizens that were surveyed, and their first response is, keep government out of my healthcare system. The second response, don't do anything to touch my Medicare. So part of it is educating the public about what government does do that is indispensable and helping us learn how to do what we do better. That must be that, huh? That must be the song. He's good at that.
It's a nice sort of gong.
It's a very nice song. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we've been listening to Valerie Jarrett, Senior Advisor to President Barack Obama. Thank you, Ms. Jarrett. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.